Mr. Secretary, thanks for joining us
Thank
here.
you.
This is an amazing studio, so I appreciate you taking the time to sit down with us here.
Thanks for joining.
So, massive news today. The United States voted against a Europe-led resolution at the United Nations to condemn Russia for the invasion of Ukraine, and then later a U.S.-led resolution passed the Security Council. Talk to us about what happened there at the...
Well, on the broader resolution, we think the UN needs to get, if it's going to be useful in the 21st century, the UN needs to get back to its charter mission, which is the prevention and the ending of war and conflict. And so we felt, everyone knows, you can go back and read newspaper articles over the last 3 years and figure out what happened in Ukraine. But now, as the president's made very clear, President Trump wants to end this war. He thinks far too many people have died and he wants to bring it to an end. So we didn't feel it was conducive, frankly, to have something out there at the UN that's antagonistic against either side. We're trying to get these guys to the table. And unfortunately, Ukraine didn't agree. They wanted to move forward on theirs. We then went to the Security Council with our compromise, which I think is a very fair language, and it basically says war is a terrible thing. I mean, I'm paraphrasing and I'm being simplistic, but it says war is a terrible thing. Way too many people have died. This war needs to end in a way that's enduring. In essence, echoing President Trump's view of what this conflict needs to be, and reminding the United Nations that the purpose of the United Nations was the prevention of war and the ending of conflicts, not making it harder to end conflicts. So I thought it was good that we got it done at the Security Council. The Russians didn't veto it, which is a good sign. I'm not telling you that that is going to end this conflict, and I can't wait till Elise Stefanik is there because it'll be great to have her leadership. But I certainly think our language is better language and hopefully furthers the cause of peace.
President Trump today, alongside French President Emmanuel Macron, said that he hopes that this can be resolved in a matter of weeks, not months, weeks. What are some of the major steps that we need to take to get to that point?
Well, I think the president would want it to end yesterday. Right? He thinks already too many people have died. There's been too much destruction. By the way, I think everybody should be very happy that President Trump is a peace president. We have a president that wants to end wars, not start new ones. He wants to end human suffering, not exacerbate it or extend it. Now, that said, it's a conflict. It's a war. And it's going back and forth. We got to get them both to the table, starting with the Russians. So we met with them last week, and the basic question of that meeting was, are you interested in ending this conflict or not? A lot of people don't know the answer to that. If you talk to some in Europe, they'll tell you that Putin is not interested in ending the war. They said they would be under the right conditions. We didn't discuss what those conditions were. So the next step now is to meet with them again at some point with the right group of people in the room and begin to outline what would it take for Russia to stop a war. And obviously we got to ask Ukraine the same question, because you can't stop a war unless both sides agree to it. So whether it takes days or weeks or what have you, we're going to begin that process. It may not work out, but why would anybody criticize President Trump for wanting to end a war that's cost billions of dollars, hundreds of thousands of lives, and tremendous and ongoing human suffering?
Mm-hmm. If you listen to the establishment media tell it, they're a lot of them are criticizing you guys. They're saying that, oh, you guys want to give away the store to the Russians or whatnot. Can you push back on that criticism?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think it's hypocritical. These are the same people, by the way, that were arguing that after October 7th, when these savages went in and did what they did in Israel, that somehow Israel shouldn't do anything about it. So these are the same people that were demanding a ceasefire and an end to hostilities and allowing Hamas to survive. On the other hand, they're arguing, no, let the war in Ukraine go on. Let it go on for a couple more years. Let us continue to spend billions of dollars and thousands of lives being destroyed. Let a country be destroyed. So it's hypocritical. And I think at the same, usually in American history, presidents have been applauded when they seek peace, except for Trump. President Trump, on the other hand, is attacked by these outlets for wanting to seek peace. And in any negotiation, we're not going to negotiate through the media, but in any negotiation to end a war or a conflict, there's going to have to be give and take. Each side is going to have to give up something. They're going to have to give something. Everyone knows that. That's mature foreign policy. So we don't pay a lot of attention to the criticism because, frankly, no matter, for some of those voices, no matter what President Trump does, they're going to criticize him. But they've been doing that now for 8 years and it didn't work.
Mm-hmm. I know you don't want to negotiate through the media, but there's a couple of things specifically that have come up in public comments from various sides. First is that Vladimir Zelensky has said that if they're not going to be in NATO, and it seems to be people are coming to the realization that Ukraine won't be in NATO, that he wants nuclear weapons. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't think anyone would think that's a serious offer on their part. Nor do I think equipping them with nuclear weapons is the solution to the problem. I haven't heard him say that, so if he's out there saying that, I don't think that's a realistic demand to have. We need less nuclear armed countries, not more, nor do I think that solves their problem as they view it. I think here the fundamental challenge is, okay, how do you reach an end to the conflict that's enduring, that's going to be in place, that's not all of a sudden going to lead to a new war in a year or 2 years or 3 years? And that's the kind of thing that'll have to be talked about in any negotiation. But I don't think nuclear weapons are the answer to that.
Mm-hmm. Another big thing is that the Russians have seized a number of Western companies, right? Like, so a number of European countries, but in October they just took a first American company, which is this canned food maker called Glav Product. It's owned by Universal Beverage, which is a wholly owned U.S. company. Is that something that you guys will be pressuring the Russians?
Well, that'll be part of a conversation. Look, as part of this, is step 2 in this process. Step 1 is we got to get our embassies working. Our embassy in Moscow barely functions at this point. I mean, we have great people working there, but they can't function because the Russians have made life miserable. So we got to get that straightened out. I remind everybody that at the height of the Cold War, like in the worst days of the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the United States still had a relationship. We still spoke. Thank God we did during the missile crisis, for example. And ultimately, had we not kept that communication, the Cold War would have never ended, theoretically, or could have ended in, terrible things, in World War III. So that's step 1. Step 2 is we had to invite them and see, okay, if you guys are serious about ending this thing, let's sit down and talk about it. I think step 3 is if we can end this conflict, what does U.S.-Russian relations look like in the 21st century? Are the things we can work on together geopolitically or maybe even economically? The president's talked about that. There are opportunities to work together, and obviously that's going to entail talking about not just Russian assets that have been seized by America, by the Europeans or the U.S. or what have you, but also American companies that have been hurt. So that'll have to be part of a broader conversation about how to reset our relations. We're not at that step yet. I want to get ahead of ourselves. None of that's even possible. We can't even really talk about those things or fix those things until we bring this war at least to some sort of enduring ceasefire, hopefully permanent end.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you mentioned the Cold War. It's been decades now since the Cold War has been won. The wall came down, the Soviet Union cracked up. But one of the things that happened at the height of the Cold War was Richard Nixon went to China, right? We're seeing the Russians and the Chinese, working more and more closely together these days. Is the hope here almost kind of an inverse of that strategy here of, a Trump goes to Russia type thing, or very similar to like Nixon goes to China?
Well, I don't know if we'll ever be successful at peeling them completely off a relationship with the Chinese. I don't think having China and Russia at each other's neck is also good for global stability because they're both nuclear powers. But I do think we're in a situation now where the Russians have become increasingly dependent on the Chinese. And that's not a good outcome either, if you think about it. I mean, the idea that somehow, the big story of the 21st century is going to be U.S.-Chinese relations. And if if Russia becomes a permanent junior partner to China in the long term, well, now you're talking about 2 nuclear powers aligned against the United States. And even, 10 years from now, 5 years from now, if this trend continues, we could find ourselves in a situation where whether Russia wants to improve its relations with the U.S. or not, they can't, because they become completely dependent on the Chinese because we've cut them off. So I don't know if that's a good outcome for us. I think a better outcome for us would be to have relationships. Look, we're going to have competition and even potential, direct confrontation, not military, I hope, but otherwise with the Chinese, because they're doing all kinds of cheating and stealing when it comes to trade and economics. And we're going to have disagreements with the Russians, but we have to have a relationship with both. These are big, powerful countries with nuclear stockpiles, large militaries. They can project power globally. And I think we have lost the concept of maturity and sanity in diplomatic relations. We have, part of diplomatic relations is the ability to communicate with and manage through problems with other great powers around the world to avoid war and to avoid conflict. But I think having a situation where the Russians are permanently a junior partner to China, having to do whatever China says they need to do because of their dependence on them, I don't think that's a good outcome for Russia, and it's not a good outcome for America or for Europe or for the world.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so your first trip as Secretary of State, you went to Panama.
Yeah.
You convinced the Panamanians to leave the Belt and Road Initiative. This is the Chinese plan for global domination, right, for creating a hegemony. Talk to us about the importance of that development.
Well, look, the Panama Canal was built by the United States, and we built it because without it, it'd take days and days for us to get over to the Pacific. And it's a very important strategic situation for us. Unfortunately, Jimmy Carter gave it over to the Panamanians. You wake up 20 years later, and because of a bunch of issues, including corruption, the Chinese basically own the two big ports, the Hutchinson ports, on both sides of the canal. And so in a time of conflict, with those ports and all the other sort of tentacles they have established in the canal, in a time of conflict, the Chinese could impede canal traffic. That's the fear. As President Trump likes to say, we didn't give the canal back to China, we gave it to Panama. So I think also under not the current president of Panama, who's very pro-American, but a previous president, the Panamanians abandoned Taiwan and took in all kinds of money and became more pro-China. And so it's good that we have a partner there who is more pro-American, and he did end the Belt and Road Initiative, which is the first country in Latin America to end the Belt and Road Initiative. It's good that they're undertaking an audit of the Chinese companies that run those two ports. We'll see how that audit turns out. I think they're going to find some bad stuff there when they do that audit. So hopefully that will not be owned by them. It's good that last week the admiral that runs Southern Command visited Panama and signed a cyber agreement, because Panama is very concerned that the Chinese have created, and others may have created, cyber intrusions that threaten the stability of the canal. So these are all positive developments. And on top of that, they took back 300-400 migrants that we sent from third countries, not Panamanian, from other countries. They were flown to Panama. They're sent to a camp in the Darien Gap. About half of them are already been sent out to their original country of origin. These are people that were in America. They were not Panamanian, but we wanted to get them out of the United States. They went to Panama, and from Panama they've gone to the countries of origin, their original countries. And we hope that the rest, will be able to migrate back to their country of origin. And additionally, and interestingly, there are a lot of migrants that were halfway to the U.S. when President Trump took over. They got the news that it's no longer Joe Biden in the White House, and migration in the U.S. is not going to be allowed like in an illegal way. They've done a U-turn, and now they find themselves back in Panama, and Panama is also asking us to help facilitate them getting back to their home country. They have like 500 Venezuelans trying to get back to Venezuela. So this is all good. I think you see migration numbers collapse, illegal migration numbers collapse in the last 4 weeks since President Trump took over. I think we've been able to end the sort of mass migration crisis at the border. Now we have to keep it that way, and we have to deal, obviously, with the people that are here illegally, especially the violent criminals, very dangerous people.
So I want to get back to Latin America and the Western Hemisphere in a minute, but really want to zone in on a little bit more on China. Particularly, one of the things, it's felt like the United States, we've been playing defense against the Belt and Road Initiative for a long time, but now it's starting to feel like we're playing offense, maybe, against them. A couple weeks ago, Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India, was here meeting with President Trump, and they signed agreements focusing on what they call IMEC, which is an economic corridor from India through the Middle East, through Europe to the United States. Feels like the first real competitor, if you will, to the Belt and Road Initiative, a real economic corridor.
And I think there's more big deals like that coming under President Trump. It's interesting because I know you always read that President Trump's an isolationist. He's not an isolationist. President Trump, what he wants is America to be respected again in the world, and for our interests to be defended all over the world. It is not in our interest to live in a world, particularly in the hemisphere we call home, surrounded by countries that have taken on loans and debt from China that put them at China's mercy. China loans you all this money, you can't pay them back, and now they hold that over your head, and you have to vote with them at the UN, you have to do whatever it is they tell you to do. In the direction we were going, we were going to wake up one day and realize that the Chinese were setting up naval bases in the Western Hemisphere, that from where they can threaten us. We were going to wake up and realize that they were the dominant trading partner with all the countries that are our neighbors. So I think with President Trump, there's a desire, and I think you see the work already beginning to reverse all of that. It's not just in the hemisphere we call home, but also around the world. In the Indo-Pacific, we have allies over there: Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, India, obviously. And these are countries that don't want to live in a Indo-Pacific dominated by China, where they're considered vassal states. They want the U.S. to remain their partners. They want us to remain engaged and involved. And under President Trump, that's what we're doing, from a position of strength, not from a position of weakness. So
a week or so ago, I moderated a panel with the Greek and Cypriot deputy foreign ministers, and they're very into this whole IMEC idea. But I'll tell you, it got a lot of attention after I did this with the Delphi Forum. They were were very, I'll say the Chinese were very freaked out about it. I think that they are starting to recognize that you guys in the Trump administration are serious. You mean business and you're playing offense here. I don't think it was any accident, for instance, that you guys had this meeting with the Russians in Riyadh.
Yeah, well, I think in the case of that, the Saudis have been a good partner of the United States. The Crown Prince is making tremendous progress in that country. If you think about it, at that meeting, you had the three largest oil producers in the world, theoretically, in the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Russia meeting when you talk about energy and how important energy is to the future. I think under President Trump, what you're going to have is a foreign policy of strength, a foreign policy that rewards our friends and makes it costly and to be America's enemy, to try to undermine us. I think you're going to have a foreign policy and also economic policy where we're not going to be taken advantage of anymore. For a long time, we had a foreign policy that was completely devoid of thinking about the national interest. We thought our job was to be some sort of global government. We're not a global government. We're the government of the United States. Our number one priority needs to be our national interest. It needs to be defined. You have to define what it is, and then every policy and every dollar you spend, by the way, in foreign aid has to be in furtherance of that national interest. And I think that's the kind of common sense that President Trump is bringing back to foreign policy and that we're trying to do here at the State Department.
So speaking of the Middle East, Prime Minister Netanyahu was here. Obviously, he was the first major foreign leader to meet with President Trump here in Washington. I spoke to him after his meeting with President Trump. He is very focused on expanding the Abraham Accords. He believes that that is possible. So after your trip to Saudi Arabia, do you believe that there's an opening there and possibly with other Arab countries?
I think there's a strong desire. I actually think what was behind October 7th in some ways was an effort to stop that from happening. And I think no nation, no regime in the planet is more freaked out or more anti-Abraham Accord expansion than Iran, which is one of the reasons why I think they were involved in getting Hamas to do October 7th. But I think there's a lot of countries out there that would love to enter the Abraham Accord. And obviously we got to get through this situation in Gaza that has to wrap up in a way that's acceptable to Israel and makes Israel feel that their security interests are taken into account. But assuming that happens, then I do think you're going to see more countries entering the Abraham Accords, which in my mind was one of the most historic advances in Middle East peace in decades, and which was widely mocked by Democrats, by the way, when it first happened. And we've now seen more and more countries, even quietly. We don't want to say who they are yet because they've been quiet about it, but we've even had countries, more and more countries sort of come forward and say they'd like to join as well from the region, including Africa. So I think it's something we can build on, and I think that to me, it would be one of the great developments of this term.
Just to kind of bring us full circle here, it really does feel like the world is excited to have President Trump back in the White House. My conversations, again, with people across the Middle East, throughout Asia, throughout Europe, even Africa, the Western Hemisphere, it does feel like people are, they're excited to have a deal maker back in the White House. They're ready to make a deal.
Yeah, I think they're excited to have a president, first of all, who's very transparent. Like, that's the thing about President Trump. Like, you don't have to wonder what he's thinking. He'll tell you. He says it. He says it openly. He says it publicly. I've never seen a more pro-media president. I mean, everything he does, he wants it to be transparent and in full view of the world. Today alone, as I sit here with you, I sat in on a meeting with President Macron. That was public. And then he had a press conference afterwards with President Macron. So you see that happening. I think people are excited about that. I think they're also excited about a president that just doesn't have clarity, but has common sense. And that brings back a level of common sense and maturity, seriousness to foreign policy, which involves defining what our national interests are. And I know this is kind of simplistic, but foreign policy works best when everyone clearly defines what their national interest is. When your national interests are in common, my national interest and your national interest, that's where you work together. When our national interests are in conflict, that's where the hard work of diplomacy happens to prevent conflict and managing that. President Trump sees the world that way, whether it's in economics or whether it's geopolitics. And I think the world is excited to have that because you have somebody who's not going to lecture them about ideology. He's down to the very simple, what is common sense here? What makes sense for your country and for ours? How can we work together? And if we have a problem, how can we work through it in a way that respects both sides? I think the world's been dying for that kind of leadership.
It really does feel like, too, that the establishment media is missing this bigger story that we're talking about here. I've seen some of the the hits out there, critics of yours and the establishment media. I think Politico did a big article criticizing you. I think the Washington Post had this big story about Haiti when about the foreign aid with the USAID thing, and they didn't even reach out to you guys apparently, and then they got it wrong and we got it right at Breitbart. Your thoughts on the critics and the establishment media out there?
I mean, that's why establishment media is dying. Unfortunately, it's lost all credibility, and it's not, you know, something will replace it. You guys will replace them, others will replace it. That's why we're doing more and more of these interactions and long-form interviews, where it's not a bunch of stupid gotcha questions, but serious discussions about foreign policy. They're still out there. We engage them. We also talk to them, but ultimately, I think it's more of a problem for the establishment media than it is for us in some of the things they're putting out there. There is some misleading things that lead to some chaos and concern. We'll work through it, but it's not going to stop us from our work. Truth of the matter is, when you go, I think President Trump understands they're never going to be his fans, but he's already won despite them. He doesn't need them. And we're going to do the work, and we're going to be judged in the long term by what we achieve, not what they're saying tomorrow in some article that's poorly sourced and in many cases blatantly biased in order to create headlines that are negative towards the administration. I think for the overwhelming majority of Americans, everything we're doing makes sense because it's common sense.
And then the last thing I'd ask you here, Mr. Secretary, is just the back on the Latin America question. Again, I think it's a big deal that you chose your first trip as Secretary of State to go in the Western Hemisphere, right? Usually you see a Secretary of State go to Europe or go to the Middle East or go to Asia. Why did you pick Latin America to go first? And you know, it does seem like this administration is very focused on our own backyard in a big way. Canada, Mexico, Greenland discussions, all sorts of different things.
Yeah, and I think part of it is, if you look at one of the number one things that President Trump was elected on was ending this migratory crisis. So if you look at the countries down that I visited, almost every single one of them were part of the migratory route, whether it's Panama, where it starts at the Darien Gap, whether it's Guatemala, El Salvador, Costa Rica. These are all countries that migrants were coming through, and in the case of Guatemala, were sources of into the United States. So our southern border, if you want to think about it from migration, doesn't start with Mexico. It starts all the way down at the Darien Gap. In the case of the Dominican Republic, that's a pro-American government right next to sharing an island of Hispaniola with Haiti, so they're impacted by the Haitian crisis. They're also a country where migrants and drug traffickers are trying to come through the Dominican Republic to reach the United States, but they're a great partner. So it made sense to go visit with them and talk to them as well. It's the hemisphere we live in. You know, we're no matter what happens, Mexico, Guatemala, Costa Rica, these are always going to be our neighbors, right? They're always going to be our neighbors. We can't move to a different continent. So whatever happens in those countries, for better or for worse, are going to have an impact on us. In El Salvador, we have a great pro-American president. In Panama, great pro-American president. In Guatemala, a president that wants to work with us. Costa Rica, pro-American president. Dominican Republic, the same. So yeah, we're going to pay attention to our friends, to countries that want to be helpful. And that's been missing for a long time. So it's a good place to start. I could do all my meetings in Spanish, so we save money on interpreters. That also is helpful. And I thought we're going to get, and we'll continue to get really good results from those visits.
All right, Mr. Secretary, really want to thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you.